A historic day for Trey Palmer isn't enough to overcome Purdue's offense. Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Aaron Muller, and welcome to Cobsmacked. This is a Nebraska football channel where we cover the Huskers season and team news as it progresses throughout the year. If you enjoy the video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss more videos like this. I do a preview every week and then a recap following the game. So looking at the game, this was an exciting game to watch. Although Nebraska wasn't able to overcome the hurdles and the weaknesses on the team, it was an exciting game to watch. There was a lot of offense to happen. There was a lot of big plays in the game. And as we get into the numbers, it's going to sound pretty bad, like harsh on Nebraska, but I do believe that you can be critical of a team without being 100% negative. I'm not trashing the team. I'm just kind of giving you the stats, and they're going to look at how they look. So with that being said, we're going to get right into the recap. It's the Week 7 matchup against the Purdue Boilermakers at Purdue. They came away with the win 43-37. The spread was 13.5 going into the game. So the fact that Nebraska was within 6 is something to be, looking at. Looking right at the passing yards, so Nebraska had 354 through the air on 29 attempts. Rushing, we had 122 on the ground with 23 carries, so that put us at a total yardage of 476 on 52 offensive plays. Looking at Purdue, they had 391 through the air and 54 plays, so they already had more passing plays than we had on our entire offense. The rushing yards, 217 on the ground on 47 carries, putting them at a total of 608 yards on 101 offensive plays. That is a crazy amount of snaps. Looking at our defense, we had 0 sacks on the night. According to ESPN, PFF says we had 1, but we had 0 sacks officially. We had 2 tackles for loss and 1 interception. Purdue had 4 sacks, 5 tackles for loss, and 2 interceptions. Special teams, we went 3 for 3 on our field goals, and they had 4 punts for 42 yards average. They went 3 for 4 on their field goals, and they only punted successfully 1 time for 40 yards. Looking at the first downs, it's a very big gap here. We had 15 first downs compared to their 38. Again, the numbers are going to get crazy here. Looking at the time of possession, this might be the most drastic one. We had the ball for only 17 minutes and 18 seconds. They had it for 42 minutes and 42 seconds. Penalties, we had 4 for 40 yards, and they had 2 for 14. So penalties weren't a huge problem in the game, but nearly every other category in the game Purdue dominated in. Notable stats on the offense, so we're going to look at the offense first. Thompson went 16 for 29. That puts him at a 55% completion rate for 354 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. He did feel a lot of pressure. Once again, that's pretty consistent throughout the year so far. He felt pressure on 40% of his passes, although that seemed higher watching the game. It seemed like he was always under pressure. There was always arms in his face. I'm not sure how exactly PFF calculates that, if they calculate the arms swinging in the face as pressure or if it has to be some kind of contact. But it looked like there was more watching the game, but he had 40% of his passes he felt pressure on, and Purdue only blitzed him 5 times. Again, that's kind of how it's been. I mentioned last week going into the preview that teams can either bring pressure or not. They don't need to. It depends on how much trust they have in their defensive line, and obviously Purdue had a lot of trust that their defensive line could get back to Casey. But both of Casey's interceptions came off of a blitz play, so it was effective in that regard, in which case it made him make a bad decision. Those 2 interceptions ended up being very costly for Nebraska as well, as it gave Purdue 10 points on the turnover. One of them was a linebacker kind of sitting in coverage. I mentioned that in the preview, that Casey has a tendency to overlook those guys. I didn't think it was going to be the guy that got it, but he was sitting there waiting for coverage, and Casey just didn't see him, and he jumped up and picked it off. The other one was just a poorly thrown ball to Palmer. It looked like it was underthrown quite a bit. He wasn't hit on that play, so I'm not exactly sure what caused him to underthrow it as much. But the 2 INTs obviously led to straight points for Purdue. He had some throws that he simply missed on. There was one series in the end zone. We were 4 yards out, something like that. And frustrating on that drive alone, because we did not run it once in the end zone. We were 4 yards out. We didn't run it one time. We passed it once, went way over the head of Borkature. We passed it a second time. It hit Grant right in the hands. He should have had that one. Looked like Casey might have, I don't think people were saying it looked like he put too much heat on it, and Grant just wasn't ready for that kind of speed. I don't like that excuse. I didn't like it earlier in the year. I don't like it now. It hit Grant in the hands. He should have had that. Should have been a touchdown. There was a wide open pass to Alante Brown. He was sitting in the end zone, and Casey overthrew him on that one as well. Immediately, he knew that he messed that one up. He just simply missed on that one. He once again took some massive hits during the game too. A lot of them looked painful. and he was already sore going into the game. He mentioned a lot of different things he's dealing with, and so he did say that he was looking forward to the bye week to recover. Both his shoulders are sore, as I imagine most of his body is at this point. But most of his passing success, as I mentioned, he had 354 yards in the air. Most of his passing success was due to Trey Palmer in this game. He at some point in the game, they kind of just said, screw it, we're just going to throw it to Trey as much as we can. So he became the entire offensive plan at one point. He accounted for 62% of Nebraska's total offensive yardage, and of the wide receivers, he was targeted 12 of the 18 targets. So he got the most passes thrown to him. He made the most out of those passes, and he ended the night with 7 receptions and 237 yards, which is a single game record for a Nebraska wide receiver with 2 touchdowns. You tack on another 60 yards that he had on a jet sweep or reverse play from the running game, and he had nearly 300 yards on the night. So he almost scored on that reverse play as well, but he was chased down by Jamari Brown of Purdue. It was a foot race. He could have scored there, but Jamari Brown was fast, and he kind of came out of nowhere and made that tackle. So he, as I mentioned, he accounted for 62% of the total offensive yardage. You like to have a guy that you can lean on. That seems a little excessive. You don't ever want to rely on a guy too much just in case he does get injured or does go down or he just has an off night. You don't want the whole offense to be reliant on that guy to succeed. But so far in the year, Trey Palmer has been a guy that we can rely on, and he has come out consistently and proved that he is here to play, and he is playing big-time football. So he almost became a bailout on a drive if it stalled, if we weren't able to pick up the first down or whatever. He kind of just chucked it down the field and seen if Trey could come up with the ball. When Nebraska, looking at the running side, we had 123 yards on the ground, not accounting for sack yardage. You take away 60 of that from that Palmer reverse that I mentioned, and the 3 running backs by themselves accounted for only 63 yards. So we weren't able to get, the running game going. It wasn't a great outing for Applewhite's guys, and that really affected what we were able to do on the offense. Ramir Johnson actually had the longest run on the night from a running back at 17 yards, and it was his only carry on the night as well. So he came out, had a big chunk rip off, and he kind of just didn't have another opportunity to come out. And again, I think it is because he's a smaller back. Our offensive line was not playing well again, and they don't want to send somebody out there who's undersized and could get hurt and then doesn't give you quite the opportunity to punch through a hole like Yant or Grant does. Looking at Grant and Yant, that combo combined for 15 carries and only 46 yards. So the running game was something that I mentioned. The running backs were going to have to be utilized effectively in this game, not necessarily just in the rushing game, but in the pass as well. And we just weren't able to do that on either side of that. As I mentioned, Trey Palmer at one point just kind of became the offense. You were just trying to get him an opening, kind of get him in a matchup that favored him, and he made it count for what it was worth. But we struggled all around on offense as far as consistency goes. Although it looks like we had decent yards, we did struggle to keep those drives alive. We had 5 plays go over 20 yards, including the 2 for the touchdowns. So the chunk plays were there. The explosive plays were there. But those little 3 and 4 and 5 yard plays where we can, make another first down and keep a drive going and keep the defense off the field, they just didn't happen. We were 3 for 9 on third down, so 33%. We just couldn't sustain drives. We had 15 first downs total in the game on 13 offensive drives. So you average just a little over 1 first down per drive. That's not what you want to see from your offense. The offensive line has a lot to do with those struggles, but I'm not going to beat that dead horse any more than I have to. If you go back and watch any of my videos, that's kind of my sticking point, is that the offensive line has a lot of responsibility on its shoulders for the way Nebraska has been playing. And as I mentioned in the preview, it was a longer rant than I'm going to do now, but there's just a lot of work to be done on the offensive line, and I'm not sure how much can change this late in the season. A lot of people were banking on Hunter Anthony coming in and replacing, Bryce Benhart and having better performance. They thought he played better, but I did want them to temper their expectations. I pulled out the stats. I mentioned that even though you might think he's looking better, I think that that's based off of a bias that you have, that Benhart's been playing so poorly that Hunter Anthony comes in and he can't possibly be worse. According to the stats, he is. He graded the worst on the line with a 42.4 overall on the offensive line, and he only had a 14.2 in the pass block. That's 3 weeks in a row that he has had like an under a 45 overall grade. And I warned people against putting their, that they thought that he was going to be like a saving grace at that right tackle spot, and that's a lot of pressure to put on a guy who just transferred in. There's a lot more work that needs to be done on the offensive line besides just bringing in a guy that has, good experience elsewhere. It comes down to chemistry between the 5 guys on the line, not just having your 5 top athletes out there. You need to have 5 guys that mesh well together, and something hasn't been able to click there. Corcoran didn't play well either at the left tackle spot. He has the second lowest pass grade of 41.7. Combined, the tackles allowed 7 quarterback hurries, 2 sacks, and 1 penalty. A reminder, that's only on 29 dropbacks. So a third of the plays, the tackles are letting somebody get back to Casey. A lot of times it was both tackles allowing a guy to get back to Casey at the same time. I know that they're not trying to perform poorly. I know that they're not like going out there to try to make Casey look bad or try to let guys by them, but something isn't clicking, as I mentioned. Something's not quite meshing well, and Rilo has tried just about everything he can, every different, swapping guys to different positions and trying to figure out where guys belong to be the most effective. And he's tried just about every combination he can, and nothing seems to be working effectively. It worries me that there's very little hope for this group to improve going forward. I mentioned that November looks like a hellscape for this offensive line, and Purdue had a decent defensive line, but it wasn't by any means what we're going to be seeing going forward. Illinois is going to have a crazy good defensive line, and that's not expected from an Illinois team. But then you have Michigan and Wisconsin and Iowa. These teams are going to eat on this offensive line if there's not some area that they can improve on. And it's just late in the season. These are things you need to change in the offseason, and I think it's a little bit too late for that. The inability to sustain drives on the offensive side hurt the defense equally as well, if not worse. So flipping over to the defense struggled to stop Purdue either through the air or on the ground. And although I mentioned, though, that they were on the ground a lot, Purdue had 101 offensive snaps. That is a lot of plays. You do have to credit Jeff Brohm for mixing up those plays. Once they got a lead, they didn't just start to revert to that running game and kind of milking the clock. He kept on it. He kept flip-flopping between running it up the gut for 9 yards and then passing it again. And just the different formations that they were running kept our guys on their heels, and we just never got a chance to catch our breath. They weren't even running like a tempo. They were just, consistently mixing it up and causing issues for our guys to get set and figure out who they were supposed to be blocking. Purdue ran a lot of short, quick plays to keep drives alive. They had the ability to pick up these third downs. We had a lot of opportunities on our defensive side to, we had 3 and 7s, 3 and 6s, 3 and 4s to get off the field, and we just weren't able to do it. They were somehow able to weasel those in, and weasels sounds negative, but they got the downs, they got the turnovers, they got the first down. They went 50% on their third down conversions, and then they went 2 for 2 on their fourth down conversions. So we weren't able to stop them when it mattered the most, and that just kept the drives alive, which made the defense stay out there even longer. It was just kind of a cycle of despair for the defense to work on, and that seemed to work to perfection for Purdue. Jeff Brohm simply outcoached Bill Busch in this game, and that's not saying anything bad about Bill Busch. Jeff Brohm has been known to be this kind of coach. He has been known to find your weaknesses and exploit that. He's just a good coach, and I mentioned that coming into the game. I don't have anything bad to say about Jeff Brohm. I like the way that he is able to almost snipe bigger teams. Nebraska's not by any means a giant in the league at this point in time, but he's able to do that no matter who he's playing against. He doesn't overlook really anybody. So he played against Nebraska. He had a good matchup, and he utilized that effectively. You also have to tip your cap to Aidan O'Connell and Devin Mockobee. O'Connell threw well all night. People, were kind of upset that the commentators seemed to be a big Aidan O'Connell fan, but you have to look at that and say, that was a good pass. That was good. I kept saying that all night, you got to give him props where it's due, and he played very well. He adjusted for the 8 dropped passes by his receivers. He ended up with an 84.3 completion rate. You can't knock a guy. That's best case scenario, your guy's making 8 out of 10 plays where he needs to. The pass rush just wasn't able to get back to him, which is why that completion rate could have been so high. And PFF credits them with only 1 sack on 13 pressures. So I mentioned that PFF gave them the 1 sack, and ESPN and a bunch of other outlets did not give Nebraska a sack at all. PFF gives them the 1 sack because it disturbed the play enough that he had to get rid of it. But we had 13 pressures, which is the same as Casey Thompson felt in the night, exact same. Casey felt 13 pressures, but that was only on 50 plays. Aidan O'Connell felt 13 pressures on 101 plays. So he didn't feel pressure nearly as much. He didn't get hit at all in the game as far as like actually getting taken to the ground. And it certainly didn't impact his game at all. He had the time to throw the ball, and he showed you what he could do when he had that time. You look at Devin Mockobee, he was a freshman who carried the ball 30 times. I mentioned going into the game, his most coming into the one in this game was 15 carries. He carried it twice as much for 178 yards, which is a 5.9 yard per carry average. And he had 1 touchdown on the night. He was hard to bring down. He ran hard, and he almost had like, I was watching him, and it reminded me of like rugby players. I don't particularly watch rugby, but I like watching the collision of rugby players, and a lot of them get like almost like a horse stride going, and then they just run into some dude, and that's what he was doing. He was very hard to bring down. He's not even particularly a big back. It's just his stride mixed with his of contact, I guess, it's something that's a good combination for Purdue to have. You can kind of point at specific reasons that the defense did struggle here. As I mentioned, the defense was on the field for over twice as long as the offense was. You had 42 minutes versus 17 minutes that Nebraska's offense was on the field. The 101 plays defensively was one away from a school record set in 2007 by Iowa State. Garrett Nelson played a punishing 81 of those snaps. So on the line, playing 81 snaps on that defensive line, it's going to be brutal to your body. It's a hard, those are big guys to move, and he's taking these collisions every single snap. 10 different defensive line and ed guys rotated in an effort to kind of give those guys a breather, but it didn't seem to be, we weren't able to get back there any better. It didn't matter at that point. Like at a certain point, your guys are just, gutted the way it is. So they never gave up, which is something to look at, but they were all, out of gas by the end of the game. Quentin Newsom was on the field for 103 total snaps due to penalties. So there was only 101 official offensive plays by Purdue, but due to the penalties, Quentin Newsom actually lined up for 103. It's not as physical as that defensive line might be at that number of snaps because there's not necessarily a collision every play, but he was the most tested. There's a lot of running to go there, and they knew that he was going to be gassed being out there so long. But he was also tasked with covering their best wide receiver in Charlie Jones for most of the game. Charlie Jones ended the night on 12 receptions, 132 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So even with Quentin Newsom on him, and Quentin Newsom only allowed 10 catches for 125 yards and 1 touchdown, but he was tested a lot with their best guy, and a lot of times he was just able to beat him. And so Quentin Newsom was out there for a ton of plays. Miles Farmer had a lot of plays as well, but he had a little more success. He was out there for 99 snaps, and he came up with 1 sack, 8 tackles, and he allowed no completions. But again, Quentin Newsom was targeted, I believe 17 times, and no other cornerback was targeted more than 5 times. So you got to kind of weigh your Quentin Newsom was out there for a long time, so he's obviously going to give up probably more plays than anybody else. But a lot of these guys all across the board were playing a ton of snaps, and it showed. Tackling problems arose yet again in this game. We had 18 missed tackles as a defense, and we remember a couple weeks ago we only had 5 or 3 in the whole game. Now we jumped that times 5 and we hit 18. So this really showed up against Purdue's running game against the Mockobee, as I mentioned. He kind of just, it's not like he runs through you. He kind of just bounces off of you and continues on. So what should have been a short gain, either at the line or just 2 or 3 yards, turns instead into 7, 8, 9 yards. And that was just very consistent for their running backs. Mockobee ended up coming out, and then King Daru came in, and he also had the same kind of success where we just weren't able to wrap up. And it looked like a lot of guys were almost hitting too low. They were trying to hit them in the shoes or the ankles, and I know a lot of guys want to hit you hard, but you got to learn to wrap up and drive through. It's kind of like the tackling fundamentals seemed to be missing for large portions of the game. And again, that could come down to you're so tired, you're not doing the right things. You're launching yourselves, trying to just get him down. Launching against these guys that are just driving their feet, they're just going to bounce off of you, and that's what happened for a large majority of the game. Reimer's injury also had a very big impact in the middle of the field. Couple that with Henrich left the game early, halfway through, I think, 45 snaps. He looked like he had a knee injury coming off the field, but he didn't return. So you had Ernest Houseman come in from Columbus, by the way. Again, represent Columbus. He came in and he played fairly well, but across the board, that they tested the inside of the field with the running game, with the short passes over the middle. they ran a lot of stuff over the middle because those guys aren't as experienced. You do look at Houseman, though. Like I mentioned, everybody else kind of had tackling issues. Houseman wasn't one of those guys. The last time he saw the field, I mentioned that he seemed to be in position a lot. He seemed to have the speed to get to where he needed to be. He was just a little off on his timing, and like the speed of his tackles was off. He seemed to have fixed whatever that was, the issue was there, because he had the highest tackling grade on the defense and he had 0 missed tackles. So Houseman had a good night coming in for a injured Henrich, but across the board, guys struggled on tackling guys, whether that be the cornerbacks, the defensive line, everybody, every position had issues. The silver lining here is Malcolm Hartzog, the freshman, also kind of struggled in coverage, and he missed 1 tackle, but he had Nebraska's 1 lone turnover. That means he's had a turnover in every game that he's played in so far. He recovered the blocked punt against Indiana. He had the game-sealing interception at Rutgers last week, and then he had the interception this week. So he's not necessarily playing perfect coverage, but he is always a threat to take a ball back. He didn't take it back to the house, but he's always a threat to get the ball. And so that's a silver lining, that he's a freshman and he's playing very high level as far as being a ball hawk. Looking at the special teams, so this is really the only category that Nebraska beat Purdue in. We blocked another punt, which gave us great field position. Unfortunately, that ended in a field goal on that drive. Timmy Bleekrode had 3 for 3 on the night for field goals. I think he only attempted like 3 field goals prior to this game on the whole season. So he was 100% on the night. Buschini had some rough punts. He seemed to only kick it like 33 yards a couple times, but he was serviceable. You got to remember, he's still injured. He did kick it out of the end zone at one point. His left foot is still wrapped up pretty heavily. That's his plant foot when he kicks. But he was serviceable. He ended the night with over a 40-yard average. But the most important part is that the return game finally found some success. So Tommy Hill was back there for a majority of the returns, and he seems to be the guy for the job going forward. He had 4 returns for 91 yards, including a long of 32. He had a couple opportunities where if he would have just evaded that last guy or squirted through a little gap that kind of closed up right at the last second, he would have had a ton of room to go. And it gives me hope that we may still have a house call this season. Kind of looked like maybe that wasn't in the cards, but just the way he runs, he doesn't necessarily seem fast. Like, he doesn't look like he's running super fast, but he is very elusive. He's kind of like, he just kind of weaves his way through blocks, and that's great for a return guy. So I'm hopeful that we are going to see one of these go back to the house, and that, that's something we're not used to seeing over the last few seasons. So overall, looking back at my keys going into the game during the preview, I mentioned that the 3 things we need to happen: the defensive backs need to be able to lock down Purdue's wide receivers. That needs to give the pass rush time to get back to O'Connell. So first, the defensive backs need to lock down the receivers. Secondly, the pass rush needs to get home and make O'Connell uncomfortable. And 3, the running backs need to be a big part of the offense, not necessarily running the ball. They need to be in the short pass game as well. The first 2 were kind of intertwined in that the coverage was necessary for the pass rush to be successful, and then that would help the coverage be more successful as well. So that one obviously didn't work out. Arguably, the defensive backs played fairly well in their coverages, but O'Connell had enough time to throw, and he showed you what he could do when he had time to throw it. He didn't need a ton of time to throw it. As I mentioned, 95% of their passes were 20 yards or less, so they were short, quick routes. He didn't need a ton of time to hold on to the ball, but he showed off his accuracy. There was a ton of times where he put the ball where the defender couldn't make a play on it, and as I mentioned, you have to give him credit where it's due. The pass rush was also nearly non-existent. Purdue getting the ball out so quickly didn't give us a ton of time to get back there, but still, he had a clean pocket on 77% of his dropbacks, and you're not going to get him pressured not getting back to him. So the running backs struggled as well. I mentioned that those shorter dump passes should be a big part of the offense because Purdue seems to struggle against that. I didn't think our offensive line was going to allow us to have just a pure rushing attack. And the short dump pass and having Grant kind of swing out for passes would help us overcome the offensive line issues as well. But Nebraska only attempted 2 passes behind the line of scrimmage. We didn't really utilize that as much as I thought we could. And that's just the way it is. So none of my keys hit. None of the things that I said we should do to win the game happened. I'm by no means a coach, though. I noticed 3 things that could have helped us win the game, and we weren't able to hit on any 3 of those. On the bright side, looking back at the game, Palmer had himself a a career night, a historic night as far as Nebraska receiver goes. And he is now the highest rated wide receiver in the country at 89.5. And he also has the most receiving yards in the country. So I have no doubt that other teams are going to hone in on him and try to lock him down a little more than they would have otherwise. So we do need to have those other options available. We can't rely on him for 60% of our offensive output every game. So we need to have more options available, although he is a nice deep threat to have kind of as that, that home run hit every once in a while to try to take a shot down the field. So what does this win-loss mean going forward? I'm actually not super disappointed in the game. I always joke with my wife that I have football depression. Like when the Huskers lose a game that you just can't believe they lost, you almost go into like a, shoulders down, kind of depressed for the night. I just want to go to bed at this point. I didn't have that in this game, and I haven't really had that under Mickey Joseph because it doesn't feel like we're just losing games. Obviously we're losing games, but it doesn't feel like we're throwing games away anymore. It feels like we just went out there and the other team was better. It wasn't that we shot ourselves in the foot and we kind of threw this one away. It's just that we got outplayed. I was very encouraged by the team's fight and their persistence. Despite playing from behind the entire game, we didn't take the lead one time, and yet our guys were playing with still this feeling like we can take the lead at any point. We could win this game, and that never seemed to falter. So you got to credit them there. That was encouraging to see because we haven't been used to seeing that. It's kind of been points in our past few seasons that once we kind of get down by 10 points, 14 points, we kind of turn over and just kind of give up. But that did not happen this game, and that's something that we need to look at and say, that's a very important quality to have as far as head coaches go. Looking at the team, they have a bye week this Saturday, and they can all use it. They all looked a little banged up. They all looked a little slow towards the end of the game. The 101 defensive snaps, as I mentioned, is going to take a toll on those big guys. But there's lots of opportunities to work on things that they can correct, but they do need to focus on the recovery first. So especially Casey Thompson, he is banged to hell, and he needs to get better. We can't afford to lose him, or Trey needs to get better too, even though I don't think he got hit a whole lot because he's way too fast. But we're going to need everybody at their best for the next game. It's going to be a heavy hitting game, a hard game against one of the best teams, if not the best team in the West. We have Illinois coming in after the bye week, and they look formidable. They are favored to win the West by a pretty heavy margin at this point, and they look every bit the part. Their defense is top in the country in a lot of statistics, and their offense looks just as good too. They have an incredible running back that we need to keep an eye on. But we will get into that into next week's preview. Or not next week's preview. I'm not sure what I have planned for the bye week yet. I know I had some offers to go talk on some other podcasts, but I usually find something different to do. Last bye week I did a Coach Frankenstein video, so I'll have something to put up next Saturday. But we'll look into the Illinois preview coming up. But that'll wrap up this week's recap. So be sure to check back for next week's video, whatever that happens to be. But then we will be back here before the Illinois game to do a preview of that game as well. So what did you guys think of the game? Did you have that same feeling of this team showed heart? They showed that they were still fighting even though they were behind for the entire game. Was there any other silver linings that you found besides the return game and besides Trey Palmer? Was there any other aspects of the team that you looked at and you said that gives me hope for the future? Let me know down below, or you can find me on Twitter at Cobsmacked Media. But until next time, go Big Red.